Everybody having a good day? I guess we're a couple of minutes away. Can I get that lower just a little bit? Thank you. Because it sounds like my head is about to blow out from speakers. Okay. Have we got more people on the way in? Considering that I went overtime on both my sessions yesterday, maybe I should start a bit early. I might kind of fix the problem that I'm going to be overtime today as well. I'll try not to do that. Yeah, I'm just going to say, let's do it, okay? So I'm going to talk a little bit about authentication and authorization in ASP.NET Core. And it's going to be way more authentication than authorization, to be perfectly honest, because that's just the way it is. It's the important part, because authorization is a bit more complicated and basically needs an hour on its own. But you'll see small parts of it. And also worth noting before I get started, this is ASP.NET Core 2 and above. So if you, for some reason, are still on 1, this is not going to work. Because they rewrote all of the authentication and authorization stuff between 1 and 2. So anything that worked in 1 doesn't work in 2 and vice versa. If you want to do it in 1 for some reason, have a look at the, in quotes, old stuff that was in ASP.NET MVC for .NET Framework, not for .NET Core. My name is Chris Klug. I work as a developer, consultant, architect, and public speaker at a company called 1337 in Stockholm. And I go to conferences talking about things I'm fairly passionate about. This topic is something that I am fairly passionate about, and I do have a Pluralsight course. So if there's anything in this the talk that you want to see more of or are wondering about, my course will basically be this, which is 50 minutes over and over again 3 times with different implementations. So it's if you want to go and get started with Facebook authentication, there's a little chapter of that. If you want to go and do Azure AD authentication, there's a chapter of that. So there's more if you want to go and have a look at Pluralsight. And if you don't have a Pluralsight account, come up and I can give you a code so you get a month off so you can watch that course. And by the way, if you do get a code, please watch my course, because that pays me. We all do it for the money, right? That's the way it works. Except for the public speaking, because there's no money in that. So actually, I'm just going to go and start demoing. So it's going to be a demo all the way through. I really don't want to do any more slides. I've had enough slides. So let's just skip straight into fast-paced demo for the next 45 minutes, 48 minutes. And hopefully I'll get all of it in there. So I've built this very small, very basic web application. It looks like this. You will now question every single web development skill that I have, and especially design-wise, because my web app looks like so this whole .NET Core thing is awesome because it's really, really fast. Where is Galloway when I need to see? Okay. This is it. It is, as you can see, a very simple bootstrap site, which means that it looks like every other web application on the internet, minus all the good stuff. So the only thing I've got in here is basically I've removed everything that was interesting and just kept the authentication part. So there's a login screen. Looks like that. Ta-da. There is a registration screen. Looks like that. And there is a hidden little view here called user info, which is supposed to show me information about me, who I am when I'm logged in, and obviously it goes, you suck. So I'm going to fix that. I'm going to make my application suck less by adding authentication. So let's go back here and see what we need to do. So I'm going to start off with doing basic authentication. I have my own credentials. I'm going to have cookie authentication. How many of you are running a website today where you have credentials stored in your own system and you make sure that you authenticate users? How many of you are hashing your credentials and making sure that they cannot be stolen? I hope that's the same number. I'm just going to put that out there. So we'll start there. I personally dislike that idea. I build very few systems where we keep track of credentials because I am terrified of them getting stolen or we'll have a breach, and I'll sit there with basically having to tell everyone that sorry, but your credentials were stolen. But we'll start there. It's a good start. So what we do is I pull up the startup file, and up here in configure services, I'll just go ahead and do services. This is going to be a very long demo. Services dot add authentication. So add authentication will add authentication services. Duh. It's pretty self-explanatory. It doesn't actually add anything more than supporting services. So this has not added anything that will authenticate anyone at all so far. It just adds supporting stuff. But add authentication here returns an authentication builder is the name of the class. We can then use that authentication builder to add whatever authentication we need. So in my world, I want to do cookie authentication. So on that returned app or whatever configuration stuff I got, the authentication builder, I can call add cookie. Ta-da! I have now cookie support in my application. That's all I have to do. I do need to do a few little things in here for my own sanity's sake. I'll do this. So I'm just going to change the login path and the access denied path for two reasons. One, if you do not change these paths, they default to one that I really didn't want to use in this case. So that's one of the reasons. So I wanted to have /auth/login to be the path for signing in. And access denied I want to show because that's actually new in .NET Core. In ASP.NET, we didn't have the ability to see a difference between a person who did not have access to something as opposed to a person who wasn't logged in. It was just, you don't have access, go over here and log in. In .NET Core, we actually have, or in ASP.NET Core, we have the support of saying, you are logged in, but you do not have access. That is a different thing than you are not logged in, so you need to go and log in. This gives us the ability to actually show users, you are not worthy, versus I don't know who you are. Okay, and I need to do one more thing. I need to tell the authentication system what kind of authentication I want to use. So I do that by passing in cookie authentication defaults, maybe cookie authentication defaults dot authentication scheme. So each one of these authentication handlers or schemes that we put in place have a name. They have a default name that you can change, and by default, all the ones that come out of Microsoft, like Cookie, OpenID Connect, JWT, and all of them, have an accompanying defaults class, which is a static class, and if I go and look at this, you'll see that the authentication scheme is just a string called cookies. So that's the default scheme name for cookie authentication, but as I said, you can change it and you can move it around, but that's the one that I'm going to use. And finally, the part that I generally forget is this only adds the services to the system. What I need to do finally is go down into the configure method and say app.useAuthentication. If you do not add that part, the system will kind of work, nothing will blow up, but nobody will actually get logged in. Which is kind of sucky when you're trying to get people logged in. Kind of defeats the purpose of doing that stuff up here. So this thing will make sure that the person gets logged in, and I put it here between static files and use MVC. That means that before you reach this, the user is not going to be logged in. So if you request a static file, I'm not going to make sure that you're signed in and check cookies and all of that. I'm just going to return the file. But if you pass that and you're trying to get to my MVC app, then I'm going to make sure that you are an actually signed in user. Okay, configuration done. Next step. I have a login page and a registration page. So I have an auth controller that handles all of that. And as you can see, it has actions for login, register, logout, and access denied. We'll start out by having a look at the register method. So the first action here, this one, is basically just the one that shows you the form for signing in. So it doesn't actually do anything but return a view. And then the second part is where I actually validate the information that you've sent in and I actually register the user. And the implementation for that is this. So I check that my model state is valid. If not, I return the model again with the view and basically show you forgot to fill out this stuff. Then I have a user service here, which is just a dumb very simple repository for users. And I call add, passing in the name and the email and password. I'm not doing any validation or anything in here, making sure that you repeat passwords and stuff like that. I'm just going to shove it in there. You should probably have password complexity and stuff like that, but I don't care. My users can have any password they want. And then once I've got my users, this creates the user in my database, and by database I mean JSON file on disk. I've got my user back, and I'll go ahead and say register user 1. Snippets are awesome. I always tell everyone I know that do not ever say OK to a project where you don't have predefined snippets. It takes forever to write real code. So I'm going to take out and create a list of claims, and I'm creating 3 claims in this case. And you can add as many claims as you want. Just remember that the more claims you add to your user, the bigger the cookie becomes. And if you start adding a ton of claims, you end up with a huge cookie, and that cookie then gets sent back and forth to the server on every single request. And that's not just every single request for a web page, it's for every GIF, every JavaScript file, every CSS file, anything that touches the web and goes to your server is going to include that cookie, which means that you want to make sure that you keep the cookie as small as possible but still fulfill your needs. So in this case, name identifier. This is one thing that you need to have. You need to have an identifier. Name and email are the claims that I've chosen to use. Then we have a step here where we take my claims, or my list of claims. I transform that into a claims identity, which is supposed to sort of be the person or the identity that I'm using, or the person is signing in with. And I need to tell it what scheme to use. This second parameter here, cookie authentication defaults.authentication scheme, is actually optional. You don't have to pass it in. If you don't, nobody gets logged in. I have no idea why it's optional, but if you don't pass it in, everything seems to work, but nothing actually really happens. It just goes poof, and you have to log in again, and then you don't get logged in, so you get log in again, and it goes, yeah, you get the point. Then I take my identity, I turn that into a principal, and finally, once I have my principal, I await a call to an extension method called signinAsync that extends HTTP context, and I pass in the principal that I want to use. And once that is done, I redirect the user to user information. If we save this, go back out, nope, go back over here. We go back to, actually I can refresh this. I'm now refreshing the same page that just blew up, but due to the fact that I have registered services for authentication and I have a default scheme for it, telling it to use cookie authentication, this thing is just going to say that I'm not logged in and send me off to the login path that I have defined and ask me to sign in. There's a problem with that. I cannot actually sign in because I don't have an account. So we'll go over to register instead, and I'll fill this out quickly. Actually, I think we can do that. Always have a nice and short password that you can remember. No, sorry, that was wrong. Always have a long and complex password that people won't guess. So test, like I just used, is not the right one. Okay, so I'm logged in, and you can see here user information. Here is the username for me. And here are the claims that was issued during the registration process, and I'm signed in. Was that hard? Not really. It's actually quite easy to get everything set up to sign in users. Next part, signing out. Right now, if I click logout, nothing is going to happen because there's nothing actually logging people out. So how do we do logout? Well, logout is fairly simple. We go down to the logout action, which, by the way, is an HTTP post. So the logout button is actually a form that I post to the server. There are some interesting tweaks in some web browsers, Chrome, where it sometimes pre-caches and pre-loads web pages for you. So it basically sees addresses or paths in your file, and it goes, I'm going to just preload these so that I can make your browsing faster. So if you click this, it's already downloaded. There are some tweaks that can do that. If you have logout as being one of those links that somebody can follow, it means that a browser that is nice to you and preloads things, it will preload the logout screen for you, logging you out, which is a fairly sucky user experience. So I make it a post and a form instead. And signing out a user is that. You just await HTTP context.sign out async and then redirect the user to the homepage. That's it, all we have to do. Once again, sign out async is an extension method that comes out of Microsoft's authentication stuff. And if I press logout now, and wait, and wait, I'm signed out. So that seems to work as well. Last thing to figure out is signing in. So logging in, I have the form. I don't have an actual implementation for it. So how do I do the actual login instead of just registering? Very, very simple. But due to the fact that a big part of it, this part here, is actually exactly the same for signing in as for registration, I'm going to go ahead and say extract method, sign in user, and I suffer from a serious case of OCD, so it needs to go at the bottom. And it's also not called OCD, it's called CDO, so the letters are in the right order. Just make sure you remember that. And in the login thing, I check the model state to verify that I've added a username and a password. If not, I return it and show an error. If I have, I ask my user service to authenticate the user, passing in the email and password, which then verifies that that is correct. If I get a null back, then the username or password was not correct. So I return a could not validate your credentials thing, not telling them whether or not it was the password or the username, just going invalid. But if everything is fine, I just do return, await, sign in user, passing in my user. Reusing exactly the same thing I did before, which is list of claims, claims identity, claims principal, sign in using the principal, redirect the user. So going back out here, making sure that I've saved that page, I should be able to put in my email address and my complex password, press login, I could do like 2 presentations. I could do one while waiting for the other, so I could have like 2 at the same time. That would be awesome. Nobody would understand anything, but okay. So I now have registration, signing up for my application. I have signing out, and I have logging in. So I've basically managed to add all of that to a website in 15 minutes. That is about as much time it takes, except for the actual thing of talking to a database, which you should probably do. But I've also figured out that nobody really wants to do local logins anymore. Everybody wants to do social logins. It's all about social logins. I want to federate with Facebook, Twitter, blah, 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 because that is much better. And by better, I mean better. I personally, I do use social logins for everything that I can, because I use Facebook for all my logins for the very simple reason that I trust Facebook. Hold on. Sentence is not done. I trust Facebook to steal all of my information, but they will also keep my credentials safe. Because they have, if they lose my credentials, Facebook has a massive problem. So they have smart people making sure that my credentials are safe, because if my credentials aren't safe, people are not going to use Facebook. If people are not using Facebook, Facebook cannot steal your information, and they cannot make money. So I'm going to trust Facebook to basically steal everything they can off me, but my credentials will be safe. No, exactly. No one else is allowed to steal. Facebook will, yeah. So what I'm going to do here is I'm going to add Facebook and Twitter to my stuff here. So I'm going to go back to my startup, and in here in my add authentication, I'm going to go ahead, and this is going to be slightly different because it's kind of awkward to do this inside of a piece of code. That's what I want to do. Move that in. So I'm adding more schemes in here. So I'm just going add Facebook, add Twitter, and for each one of them I configure the app ID and app secret, or consumer key and consumer secret. And also the secret part is supposed to be secret. So the idea of showing it to 100 people on a big screen is pretty dumb. And it's being recorded, but I am going to change this. So basically, this is something that I just reset this, and for the last 2 years, I've said that I reset this after every one, and I have never actually done it. But you can't really do much with my stuff because it's locked down to only allow people to use it for local host. So you can't really do anything with my demo app, so it's pretty safe. So I just add that in there, and all of a sudden I have support for those features. So all I need to do is create a UI for it. So I'm going to head over to my login view. And in my login view, I'm just going to go ahead and do something. It's called external providers, that's the one. So I'm going to go ahead and inject a service that I get from the authentication stuff called Authentication scheme provider, which is the thing that gives me access to the different schemes that are registered on the system or in the system. And from that provider, I can go and say get request handler schemes async, basically saying, can you give me all of the handlers or schemes that are available on this system that I can use? With some limitations. Let's just ignore that. But it's going to give me Facebook and Twitter back because they are registered. And then for each one of those, I'm creating a link or a button. It's going to be styled like a button that posts or leads me to login external as an action on the authentication controller, and it's passing the ID or the name of the scheme to that action. So it's going to pass in Facebook, Twitter, so that I in my action will know which one it is I want to use. Once I got that in place, I can go back to auth controller. I can do two things. We'll start out by doing it in login, so I'm going to go up here. Order of where you put it has no bearing at all. It's just, yeah, authZ. So we'll do login external. So the only thing I do in here is I have an action that has login external /ID, so it's going to be login external /Facebook /Twitter, whatever I want to use. And then I go challenge async and go, can you please challenge this user to sign in? So challenging a user to sign in basically in this case means, can you please redirect them for login with someone else? I really don't care, just sort it out for me. And I want you to do it using the scheme that is called ID. In this case, it's going to be Twitter or Facebook. And also, when you're done, can you please redirect the user to /user info on this page? If you don't add that, it is going to be nice enough to tell the system to redirect you back to this action. And the solution to that then becomes, or the problem with that becomes that you go here to sign in, it sends you to Facebook, Facebook sends you back, you end up with this thing again that goes, hey, go to Facebook, Facebook sends you back, and then you kind of get the whole thing that's going to suck. And after a while, Chrome is going to tell you that you have too many redirects, and it's going to just block. It might have happened once or twice when I've done this. So if we go and press login here, and we go to the login screen, ta-da! I get Facebook and Twitter down here, which is quite nice. And if I press Facebook, I end up at Facebook, and it asks, auth demo will receive your public profile and email address. Do you trust this thing? And I'm like, yes, I do, because I know the developer of this, and he's an awesome dude. So I'm going to go, yes. I'm going to trust this guy. However, it did not ask for permission to actually do anything on Facebook. It only gets information. It only gets the ID of the user, so email and basic information. It does not allow me to post anything to Facebook. And it comes back and it's given me a bunch of different claims here. So you can see they've all been issued by Facebook, and I get a name identifier, email address, name, given name, surname, because that's what Facebook gives me. If we log out again, press login, press Twitter, we get redirected over to Twitter. I get to sign into Twitter. I apparently don't know my passwords to Twitter. That's kind of a problem. Actually, I can solve that. I can just, sorry. I think if I go in here and do login from here, that works. And then if I go back here again, sorry about this. For some reason, I don't know why I'm not allowed to sign in there. Twitter, signed in. It goes, oh, do you want to authorize zero calls auth demo to access your account? Yes, once again, awesome developer. Authorize app. I come back and I'm signed in, and now it's issued by Twitter, and I get a name identifier, name, user ID, and screen name. However, I'm getting different claims. So in my application, I don't know now if I have a claim or not. So if a user is signed in using Twitter, I don't have an email address. But if they have signed in using Facebook, I have an email address, which makes it a bit hard for me to build an application. So what we normally do is we put in a step in between. So when you register using a third-party provider like Facebook or Twitter, we give them a form when they come back and go, here are the things that I need to know about you, can you please fill this out? So let's try and add that. And that adds a couple of cool features. So I'm back into my startup here, and I'm going to make a little thing down here. I'm actually going to go and call add cookie one more time. But this time I'm actually going to name it, and I'm going to name it temp cookie, like that. So by default, the system will not be looking at this cookie that I'm registering here. It's actually going to be looking at that cookie. So I'm going to go and tell both Twitter options.sign-in scheme equals temp cookie, like that, and we'll do the same thing up here. This will mean that when you get signed in using one of these, they will actually sign you in as this temporary cookie, which doesn't actually sign you into the system. It sets up an authentication cookie for you, but it's not going to be the one that the system reads. It's just going to be another thing on the side that's available for you to read manually, but it's not going to be a proper signing. Once I got that in place, I go back to my auth controller and I change this to say, if you're signing in with an external provider, please come back to auth/register external, like that. That did not come out well. Register external. And that means I need a couple of actions for that. So I'll go ahead and add a register external action. I cannot type. Register external, that's the one. So this thing here does a few things. It asks the authentication system, can you please authenticate this user using the temp cookie? So I manually tell it which one to use. And then if I don't get a succeed back, or it's successful authentication, then the user has not been temporarily signed in and something is wrong, so I just redirect the person back to home. Next step, use that information. So basically, in that information, I pull out the name identifier and I try to find one of those in my system. If I do already have a user in my system with that name identifier, then I sign in the user here. Otherwise, I display a form where I can get the name and the email. And I also pre-populate the name and the email fields with the data that I get from that provider. So if there is an email address, which there is in the case of Facebook, the email form will be, or email input will be filled out, and in the case of Twitter, it won't. Once I post that back, so once I've filled out that form, I post it back to my server again, and I do the same thing again. I validate that the user is actually temporarily signed in. If not, hey, go back to homepage, you're drunk. Then I checked if the model state is valid. Has the user filled out everything that they need to fill out? Yes. And then I add an external user to my system, which is pretty much a normal user in my database. But instead of having a username and a password, I assign a name identifier to them. So I can just fetch them using that unique name identifier from that service. And finally, I sign in the user again. So sign in external needs to be created. So I'll go ahead and add sign in. It's actually not called sign in. It's called, there it is. Sorry, it is called sign. There it is. So sign in external, it piggybacks on the old sign-in that I had before, but before it signs in the user, it signs out the temporary cookie. So it removes the temporary one, so I'm not temporarily signed in anymore. So first you log in temporarily, fill out the information, and then I remove that temporary sign-in and turn it into a real sign-in. So if I go back out here, need to put that in here. That stuff. So I go register, do a little dance, suffer from a serious case of being white. Come on. There it is. You see I get this registration screen, but I also got Facebook and Twitter. I go for Facebook. I get redirected to Facebook, I get redirected back from Facebook, I'm temporarily signed in, the system redirects me to this thing here where it says, oh, you're temporarily signed in and you're not in my system already. And then it goes, here are the things that I need from you. And then I press register, and it takes that data, shoves it into my database, and I have now normalized the claims that I get. So I'm going to have the same claim set up whether or not I'm on Twitter or Facebook or local login site. It doesn't matter to the system which type of authentication that I've used. Does this make sense? Cool. Is it going too fast? No, it's a resounding yes, no from one person down here, so I'm happy with that. Okay. I'm going to move away from doing social logins and local logins. We're going to move into more of the enterprise area. So I'm going to do Azure AD B2C, which is not enterprise, but it's cloud. And that's apparently something you have to have. So I have built the same thing again. I'm going to do that set a starter project. I'm going to run that so it builds for me. Once again, completely empty app. There's nothing in here. It looks exactly the same, but I'm going to use Azure AD B2C. So Azure AD B2C is kind of interesting because it's Azure AD, Active Directory, without actually giving you access to an Active Directory for real. It gives you kind of an Active Directory, but it adds what they call consumer logins on top of it. So what they give is the ability to sign in locally using an AD account in the cloud, which Microsoft handles for you, or you can add Twitter, Facebook, Google, and all of that, and all you have to do is go and configure it. So you go to the Azure portal and you go and say, oh, by the way, today I want to activate social login, so I want to have Twitter. You just add that in the portal, and all of a sudden it shows up on your login screen, and you're done. So it's a nice way of not having to handle anything, and Microsoft takes care of storing all of the credentials and all of the information. You just outsource all of it to them. Adding that to the system, starting out with an empty system, we do exactly the same thing as I did before, which is services.add authentication. And you do that correct like that. But instead of add cookie, I'm going to do add OpenID connect like that. I'm going to name this, and I'm going to name it B2C underscore 1 underscore sign underscore in. And it's going to have a configuration callback that looks something like this. So, why is it so hard to do this? Because, well, Microsoft decided to support OpenID Connect for Azure AD B2C, but being that they are Microsoft and that they like to give, well, in this case, I can support what they've done, but they have broken away from the OpenID Connect spec. So they are not following the specification. They have decided we're going to use the OpenID specification-ish. Which means that adding it to the system here is ish. There is an easier way to do this. Nowadays, there's actually one that specifically supports AD B2C that removes this step, but I want to show you what it does, which makes it a little bit different. So, they have what they call profiles. So a profile in Azure AD B2C is a thing that you can do. So they have a sign-in profile, a sign-up profile, a sign-in or up profile, and edit user account information profile. So all of these things that somebody wants to do with their user account is a so-called profile, which is something that OpenID Connect doesn't support because it only supports the idea of authenticating users. So to do that, they've added a query string parameter at the end of the URL that you're supposed to use that includes the name of the profile. Due to that, you have to register one OpenID Connect provider for each one of the profiles that you want to use. And I want to use one called sign in, one called sign up, and one called sign in or up. And the names of those profiles are then named brilliant things like B2C underscore 1 underscore, which is mandated by Microsoft and hard-coded, and then you get to add something at the end. So I get B2C underscore 1 underscore sign underscore in. And then that name of that profile needs to be reused a couple of times. So by naming my scheme here the same thing as the profile, I can figure out the name of the profile that was used using a claim later on, which is why there are some weird naming in here. But to simplify this a little bit, I've created a little helper method. ADB2C options config, that's the one. So it's a little helper down here, and it sets up my OpenID Connect stuff. and sets it up and says, here is the URL that you want to go to, and this is the name of my policy. And here is the client ID that I got from Azure AD. Here is the type of token that I want. I want to redirect here after sign out. When you come back, the callback path has to be unique per policy, otherwise it doesn't work. And also, the name claim is not the standard that you'd expect. It's actually just name instead of being a pretty long URL-based kind of thing that Microsoft normally uses. So using this configuration here, I can then go and say, okay, so I want to use this thing here, and I want to configure these options for a policy called B2C_1_sign_in. And then for each one of your policies, you have to go in and do the same thing. And it's going to be ADB2C config. That's the one. So I do that for my sign-in, for my sign-in or up, and my sign-up, so the different profiles. And if you were supporting profile editing, that would be another one. And if you support, so there are a couple of more that you can actually add in there. And then I need to tell the system, actually, I need to do two things. I need to add cookie authentication. Don't forget that. Because all of these services will just authenticate the user. Having them logged in, that's a cookie-based thing. So I need to add cookie-based authentication here. And finally, I need to tell the system what authentication to use in what scenarios. So previously, I just went in here and said, use cookie authentication, because that's all I had. Now I have a different thing. So I'm going to go and say ADB2C that. So in this case, I'm actually telling the system that in the case of when somebody wants to sign in, which is when somebody arrives at the website, please use cookie authentication. When somebody wants to sign out, default to signing out using cookie authentication. When somebody gets challenged, somebody needs to sign in, please go and use the ADB2C sign in, _1_sign_in_or_up scheme for signing in. And for the case of authenticating a user that comes in, please use the cookie one again. So you have to set up all four of them, but we only want to change one to be Azure ADB2C. And finally, down here, we have to do app.use authentication to get it to actually authenticate users. So that's all of the config that we got. I need to change my my sign-in stuff. So if we go to my auth controller, the auth controller is now a little bit simpler because it only has login, logout, register. It doesn't have any forms, any validation, anything, because all of that is up to Microsoft. So what we'll do in here is for logging in, I'm going to do an ADB2C login challenge. I'm going to return a new challenge to the user. And I'm going to say, in the case of trying to log in, use B2C _1_sign_in. That's the one that I want. And redirect to user info when you're done. For registering, use B2C _1_sign_up with the same stuff otherwise. And for logging out, we'll just do await HTTP context.signout async. That will sign out the cookie authentication by default, but I don't want to have people still being signed in to Azure ADB2C, which we'll do in a single sign-on scenario. So instead, I'll do a sign out like this, where I pull out the TFP, which is actually the name of the policy that was used when the user signed in. So it's going to be B2C _1_sign_in or one of the other policies. And then I go and say, please sign out using this scheme. With that stuff configured, it's not a whole lot. It's a little bit to get your head around, but it's, to be perfectly honest, it's not that much. If I go back out here, you'll see what Microsoft will actually give me out of the box, which is quite neat. I have done some configuration. I have set up an ADB2C in Azure. I have created the profiles. So there are a bit of mucking about with Azure to get this to work, but it's all well documented. But if I press register now, and the internet gods like me, I end up at Azure. So I'm on microsoftonline.com now. And I get the options here. So I have prepared it for email, Facebook, and Twitter. I'm going to go email because it has a very interesting feature. You get this sign-in thing, and I can add, when I configure this, I can also say that I want to have other information. So I want you to provide this, and that, and custom stuff and everything, and Microsoft will make sure you add it. So I'm going to go and say, I'm going to have Chris send verification code. And there's a scary part here, because if you start typing your password while it's sending the verification code, once it's sent the verification code, it actually focuses back on verification code, showing everybody your password in clear text. Somebody did not consider people demoing this on a big screen. So, verification code. Phone, and hopefully they have sent me an email. But I like the fact that they do offer you the ability to get email verification without having to do anything at all. It just magically works. It just magically works. There it is. It says Microsoft on behalf of blah, 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 and my code is 246. Haha, thank you. 246.161. Verify code. Do not store that. And I removed one letter too much on that, I think. And display name is 0col. And I get signed in. Woo! It works. And I get a bunch of claims here. And I get things like, is this a new user as a claim? Here is the profile that was used, which was that claim that I pulled out to figure out how to sign out. And I get a unique name identifier and an object identifier from Azure AD and things like that. And if I sign out, you'll see briefly that I get shoved. No, you don't. But I actually get shoved off to Azure to sign out and then come back in here again. And if I go to /userinfo, it will redirect me over to Azure for the sign in or up. So for sign in or up, I will get the ability to sign in, but I also get a sign up now link at the bottom here. And if I go and do sign in, it just comes back. And if I want to go ahead and just, I've got 10 minutes, I think I have time for showing off this. If I go here and I go register and I go Facebook, I've already approved this app in Facebook, so I'm not going to get the Facebook approval page because I've already done that in my previous demo. But I will end up back here and it will give me a form and everything, and I can once again configure this to say I want you to collect their address information or username or whatever. And when you click continue here, what actually happens is that it creates a user in the Azure AD, and they have handled all of that information for me. So Azure AD B2C, quite an interesting idea on how to do it. But it's not really AD as you're used to it. So it doesn't have the same ability of federating ADs and things like that. It's only for this stuff. But it does put that stuff out of your hands, which is kind of nice. My final demo is going beyond that and saying, hey, I actually want to run my own identity stuff. You can set a startup. But I want to have it, I want to manage my own credentials, but I do want to have it in a separate entity so that I can perform single sign-on and things like that and support more complex scenarios. And to do that, we have something called Identity Server. Identity Server is an open source project built by the community, and by the community I mean two guys. There are more people involved, but it's mainly Brock Allen and Dominic Bayer doing it. And they build this awesome tool, and you can just download it and run it, and there's no cost involved, and you run your own identity provider. So I've just literally installed the NuGet package, added a couple of things in my startup file to get this working, and added some configuration and things like that. There's very, very little to do, to be perfectly honest. It doesn't come with a UI, but they do have a UI that you can download from GitHub, and you can restyle this to look whatever you want it to look like. But they have added all of the functionality to support things like OpenID Connect. So if you want to have an OpenID Connect endpoint that you control, this will do it out of the box. All you have to do is manage getting users and credentials and all of that, and basically taking care of authenticating users. They will make sure that you follow the OpenID Connect spec. So this is kind of cool. I've got that up and running, and I want to use that as my identity provider in this next demo. So I'm going to do set a start a project. How do we configure that? Well, we do the same thing as we've done 2 times before. Configure services, services.add authentication, add OpenID Connect, like that. Have some config. Config in this case is setting up the authority, basically where is my OpenID Connect endpoint located. And if you're a complete idiot, like me, and you've decided not to host your identity provider over SSL, which you, by the way, should never, ever, 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 ever do, and I will Freddy Krueger you if I figure out that you've done it, you have to specifically say require HTTPS metadata equals false. So that is me taking on the responsibility of saying, yes, I know that I will be passing credentials on an unsecure connection. I do that because I demoed this, and I'd moved around machines and stuff like that, and having SSL, trusted SSL on my machine caused some issues. So I'm just doing it for the demo. Do not in any way turn off that stuff, okay? We're okay. Next, I also have a little handler here that says on remote failure, which is an interesting thing. If somebody goes to an endpoint like OpenID or Identity Server or Azure AD B2C or whatever and press cancel, that is actually considered an error. So if I had, or a failure. So if somebody presses cancel on that provider, you actually have to manually go in here and say, I'm going to handle that. Otherwise, it actually just explodes and you get an error screen because somebody pressed cancel. Not a great solution, but that's the way it works. Few other things. I give the client ID, which is identifying it to Identity Server. I tell it where to go after a redirect or a sign out. Save tokens is a requirement here, so it stores the original authentication token that we get. Without that, we cannot get sign out to work properly because OpenID Connect follows a spec that says, unless I uniquely can identify you during sign out, I will not allow anybody to redirect to a different address. So setting that to true is required for sign out to flow to work perfectly. And after I got that configured, I add cookie authentication because once again, Identity Server will authenticate, cookie will persist it and make me signed in. And finally, I need to do a IDS auth defaults. Once again, I do the same thing as I did before. I tell it to use cookie authentication for everything but challenge. So that's all of my configuration for that. And before I forget it, app.use authentication down here. That's all I need from a config point of view. If we look at the controllers, I have an auth controller in here. For the challenge to log in, very simple little challenge. I just call challenge, that's all I have to do because it's already configured knowing that it should use Identity Server or OpenID Connect for the challenge. And I tell it to redirect to user info. And for signing out, we've got kind of the same thing again. Sign out my local thing, my cookie, and then sign out using OpenID Connect, which means redirect to Identity Server to sign out to get the sign in there to sign out as well. If we run this, I have 3 more minutes. Please be fast. Please be ridiculously fast. Please stop spinning. There it is. I'm here. I press login. And since it's OpenID Connect, it's pretty much you can do this for Identity Server or any other OpenID Connect endpoint in the world. I press login. Identity Server boots up. I press login. Identity Server boots up. It looks less than awesome, but you can restyle all of this. I have a username here. I have a password, I think. And I sign in. And I get the same thing here, but I have full control over the identity provider as well. I have one more thing I want to show you, because I put in what I call a SPA here, and by SPA I mean a JavaScript on a web page. Probably not the same thing, but let's call it a SPA. it has a button. I click the button, and it does a web call to an API backend, which is hosted in the same application. There are a couple of problems here. It gives me a response back, even though you're supposed to be authenticated, because it authenticates the user using the cookie, and we should never use cookie authentication for JavaScript access to APIs, because we got cross-site scripting issues with that, and cross-site request forgery. So what we want to do is we want to make sure that we pass tokens in an authentication header instead, using JWTs, for example. And I want to do that, and the way we do that for this is actually quite simple. Actually, you can get around the problem by not hosting your API in the same domain as your web application. That kind of relieves that whole problem of this working. But I put it in specifically to show you that there are some issues with this. So what I want to do is I'm going to add some stuff in here. I'm going to add a, let's see what the name of that snippet was, IDSJWT auth. There it is. So I'm adding another handler in here, or another scheme called JWT bearer scheme. JSON Web Token bearer. Once again, I give it the authority. Where is my identity provider? I tell it that I am a moron, and I tell it what audience that I require the user to be part of to be able to be allowed in here. Once I got that in place, I can now handle JWT tokens, but I can still call it because the web API is just going, I don't care how you signed in. If you signed in using a cookie, that's fine because I know who you are. That is not fine. So we go to the API, we go to the API controller, and in the authorize attribute here, this is the authorization part of my demo, we can go in here and say authentication schemes equals, and just give it JWT bearer defaults dot authentication scheme. That now means that if I press call spa here and wait, it goes access denied, or sorry, unauthorized. I don't know who you are, because I've now told the API to only trust bearer tokens. So to solve that quickly, just to verify that it actually works, I can go to my home screen, or sorry, my spa, make some small changes here to make it actually use a little client script to sign in the user using that same identity server. How about you allow me to do that, and this. So what it does while I reload this is, when I load this page, I have a login button. It can be done silently as well. I can click a login button. It will pop up a UI for a person to log in, like this. But since I'm already signed in to that identity server, I get single sign-on in the JavaScript, which is why I can do this silently as well. And if I press call API, it is now actually passing a JSON web token in a header, and it gets authenticated using that instead. So this works. And if I were to sign out from my cookie and everything like that, I get logged out and I come back here. If I go to my spa, I am actually still signed in because that access token that I was using is stored in local storage. So if I call the API here, I can still call it. So there are actually two completely separate authentication mechanisms in the same system. That's a lot of stuff to cover in 50 minutes. I'm 1 minute past. I'm really sorry about that. I will be around for a little while. If you want to look at the code, it's available at that address. If you want to see more of the same fast-paced, short, do this for a specific thing you want to solve, my Pluralsight course will do that for you. Thank you so much for listening, and thank you for having me in general.